Hello, climate warriors. Welcome back to the Climate Network. Today's guest is someone who has traveled far and wide to report on how climate change impacts people with disabilities. But that's just not it. Why don't I let him introduce himself?
Hi there, Deepsha. My name is Jason Strother. I am an American multimedia journalist and educator. I teach journalism at Montclair State University in New Jersey. But for the past 20 years, I've worked in the news industry, mostly as a freelance correspondent based in Seoul, South Korea. And I'm also a National Geographic explorer and most recently a U.S. Fulbright scholar.
I don't know. This is your umpteenth visit to Orissa.
I guess technically my third this year, but it feels like home.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And Orias are also known for their kindness and hospitality. I hope you're having a good time here.
Always. And this is something that really left an impression on me. When I arrived here in February earlier this year, so quickly I was impressed by the hospitality, just the kindness and just openness of people. There was no reason to help this foreign American journalist, Fulbright researcher coming in here talking about climate change and disability. But everyone opened doors for me. It was so easy to meet people here, more so than the other places that I've worked in this year. And that really enabled me to, I think, really dig deep into my project while I was in Odisha. And yeah, that's full credit to the people of your state.
I'm going to address the elephant in the room. You've already mentioned it. Why should anybody listen to you? A person who's from US, who doesn't stay here, who doesn't understand the state, the language, the people, and you're representing a community which is very vulnerable, and they've accepted you in.
And very diverse. Certainly that's a great question, and I think that is a question that a lot of people are asking about the role of foreign journalists, foreign correspondents. What does someone from another culture, from another background, who parachutes into a new place, what can they really say about the land that they have arrived in? And especially, and of course, there's a lot of, it's often been journalists from Western countries, white men, which I'm one of, that have had these roles. So there's a lot of negative baggage attached with that, and deserved baggage too. But what I can say is that, I think the best role of a foreign correspondent is that they come to a new place with a new, fresh perspective, that they can land in a place like Odisha or wherever and see things anew. And if they
also without biases, I think.
Well, sure. I mean, they probably come with their own biases from North America or wherever they're from. But I think a good journalist will do their best to set aside those biases and talk to as many local people and a diverse group of local people as possible to help inform their viewpoint. And I mean, I think curiosity is what all journalists should share in common. So yeah, I mean, certainly, I'll speak for myself. I was really interested. I had never heard of Odisha. Never heard of Bhubaneswar, let's say 3 years ago.
That was going to be my question.
Sure.
You worked in Maldives, you worked in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India. You lived in South Korea for years together, covering
15.
North Korea.
I've reported from at least a dozen countries. So
Wow.
I've been, I've traveled to, a few dozen countries.
But how did you end up in Orissa?
So I was applying for this Fulbright grant. So the Fulbright is a fellowship, let's say, from the U.S. government. It's largely for academics, but also for other professionals, including journalists, also artists. And they had a South and Central Regional Research Award that they were offering in 2021 for the academic year of 2022 and 2023. So I could pick 3 countries in South or Central Asia to conduct my fieldwork. And I thought, I knew I wanted to expand on my reporting about how climate change impacts people with a disability. So I wanted to get as many countries in as possible. I'm always someone who's done relatively short reporting trips, 2 weeks to a month, to do stories. So I felt, normally a Fulbright is like 10 months long, and I thought that would be too long in any one place, especially for this type of reporting. So India had to be part of that. If I was going to spend time in South Asia, it had, India, needed to be one of the countries that I picked. So I Googled India, climate change, disability. And all the references that came up toward the top were based here in Bhubaneswar.
Amazing.
In particular, the SMRC, which is run by Asha Hans, a retired professor from Utkal University here, and whose brother, the late Ashok Hans, started this organization back in the 80s, I believe. And they had a lot of resources on their website about climate change and how it impacts people with disabilities in Odisha. And I thought, what is this Odisha? Is it a city? Is it a state? No idea. So I reached out to Asha Hans, and I got an email back from her really quick. And she said, look, if you're going to come, and she's a Fulbright alumna herself, she said, look, if you're going to come to India to research climate change and disability, there's a lot going on here in the state of Odisha. We are very vulnerable to cyclones forming in the Bay of Bengal. And, ever since 1999, the super cyclone, there has been a lot of work here, a lot of progress in DRR, and the disability community here in the state have really pushed for disability accessibility and inclusion in disaster risk reduction protocol. So it just made sense to do that, to choose Odisha as my base for a few months as part of this program.
You mentioned the community. Could you please tell us a little about the community?
Sure.
I believe that is one of the largest minority groups, which is so diverse.
That's
that
right.
Pulling them all together would have been a task.
Well, that's the thing, right? So, according to the World Health Organization, UN, the global figures for disability is that around, up to between 15 and 16% of the global population, 1 out of 5 people, 1 billion people, have some type of physical, sensory, or developmental learning disability. In the US, we say 25% of Americans, 1 out of 4 of Americans have a certain type of disability. That includes myself. I have a low vision disability, which I guess has informed my life experience, has informed my reporting on these topics. But I think there is some debate whether or not is it really a global community? People who are totally blind might not see a lot of connections with, people who have Down syndrome, for instance. In America, we have, what people would call the deaf, capital D, deaf community. Many people who are hard of hearing see themselves as having a very unique identity. They have their own language. They have their own means of communications. They have their own university, Gallaudet in Washington, D.C. There is deaf culture, some would say. And I'm hearing that now with people who are on the autism spectrum. They want to be called autistic because they see it as the most important mark of their identity. And that's not the same for everybody. We don't really hear that too much out of people who have a vision disability, talking about the blind capital. There is no capital B blind community that at least hasn't taken off yet. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a part of that community. I think having a low vision impairment is just one of many characteristics that make up who Jason is. Community could be a little journalistic or academic shorthand to talk about the entire population of people with disabilities. But if you look at what things that would typically bind a community together in any context, is that I think people with all types of disabilities, regardless if it's, they use a wheelchair or they need assistive technology to read, as I do, or, perhaps, require some sort of services, educational services to, assist with dyslexia or other some sort of learning disability. They all need accessibility. The common thread, the through line is that people with a disability often require some form of accessible device, software, infrastructure, or services. So I think if there's any commonality that this population has that could justify it as being a community is the need for accessibility.
Would you say vulnerability is also something that ties everybody and all these physical and invisible disabilities together?
Sure. I mean, and thank you for making that distinction. I mean, many people have a disability, but you would never know it.
Could you give us a few examples?
I mean, some people who are on the autism spectrum, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, these people who are on this particular range of the autism spectrum, they have jobs, they work fine, they have families, you wouldn't know if you bumped into them at the supermarket that there was anything. But the way they process information, the way they communicate, let's say, to someone who's not tuned into where they are on the spectrum might seem different. And, maybe they do need assistance. Maybe when they were in university or in elementary education, maybe they would have needed some sort of, educational materials to support them, some sort of job training or some sort of other counseling therapy to help them adjust and have a job and and improve communication skills. Of course, it varies. Autism has such a range. It really varies person to person. But that's a type of invisible disability. Or dyslexia. How would you know if someone is dyslexic unless maybe you force them to read a book in front of you?
I believe most of the time they also do not know about the words, about the literature, or even the fact that they might be autistic or be dyslexic, or there's nothing, no hard and fast rule that shows you that you are differently abled, or you're a person with disabilities and you should be availing XYZ policies and protocols.
Right. And I hear, I think within the autism community, here I go, autism community, but at least people who have identified as having autism, there is a lot of pushback. It's, what do these normies, want us to think, that we're all different? So what if we, are obsessed with trains or,
I love the word normies.
Yeah. So that's, there's pushback to some of these classifications. And, is this mainstream society just trying to make people who are a little different conform to social norms? And
it's a taboo
I
as
hear
well.
that. Well, it's certainly. I mean, I think in some countries disability is more stigmatized than in other places, but certainly, I grew up in a certain time where, I certainly have felt self-conscious about my own disability. I certainly have tried to hide it at certain points in my life, and otherwise, underplay it, maybe give it less importance than it actually is, or in some ways denying that I have a disability, more so when I was young than now. But yeah, sure. And we call that ableism, right?
Yes. And then there are so many myths around it as well. Say, for example, squint eye. In India, they believe that if you have squint eyes, you're lucky. And you bring in a lot of wealth, and they don't correct it.
So I did a report about that back in 2012 during my first trip to India. I went around with some advocates in Delhi that were trying to convince families to get corrective surgery for their children who had crossed eyes, a squint. But because of this superstition that it's an auspicious sign, that it brings a family good luck, some families were reluctant. But the problem is, if that kind of condition isn't corrected when a child is young, it can lead to permanent vision loss. And I saw that in this family. They had multiple people in this family who, at different ages, who had this condition. And I think for the eldest daughter, it was too late to do anything corrective, and she had low vision. But I think they did have success in getting the son, who was at the time 7 or 8 years old, to get corrective surgery.
I call that selective ignorance. One of the gaps that I have recognized exists here, that you choose to be ignorant about it, whereas you could have helped the person who is in your care. The primary caregiver decides to ignore it. Happens with autism all the time.
Sure.
Happens with, like you said, squint eyes and cross eyes.
And there could be a gender bias there too. Is a family going to be more likely to get corrective if they're going to spend money or resources getting a corrective surgery for something like that can be corrected? Are they going to prefer giving that to the son over the daughter? I mean, these are concerns too.
Absolutely. And can we discuss the common vulnerabilities that the community faces?
I think vulnerability is something that many people across the board face. But, I think we have to look at disability generally from an intersectional sort of lens from that perspective. And the wealthier you are, the less vulnerable you are.
Oh, wow.
And in terms of disasters, which what I'm researching this year, people who have even very severe disabilities that are wealthy, they can live in high-rise apartments. They can afford having a full-time caregiver. They can have access to medications and assistive devices. Whereas people who are often really on the front lines of climate change, and I'm thinking of people who I met on the coastline here in Puri or in other kind of economically depressed areas around the state, these are people who live in poverty. They don't have access to effective assistive devices, or if a device wheelchair breaks, it could take months to get that repaired, or just not at all. Vulnerability. Your level of vulnerability often goes in tandem with your level of economic mobility. So sure, people with disabilities, do have certain vulnerabilities that non-disabled people have, but I'd say the severity of the vulnerability is impacted by one's wealth.
Very, very interesting. I'd never thought about the fact that 80% of the crowd would be getting government assistance, whereas only 20-30% of the lot would be economically well off enough to provide those facilities to their own.
Sure. And I mean, these are systemic things, why is there a correlation between disability and poverty? And I think if you look at, from the start with education, if someone who's, let's say, born with a disability or acquires a disability at a young age, are their schools accessible? Was that student able to even physically get into their school if there wasn't a lift or a ramp? Were there educational materials available in accessible formats like Braille or a sign language interpreter? In the U.S., we've made a lot of progress over the past 30 years with having these services available, but certainly that does not exist in many other countries. So I think it's the lack of access to education at an early age then complicates one's ability to get a job later on and have all the other benefits that a middle class life entails. So disability can compound these complications and they just kind of multiply and multiply.
Can we talk about more lacks, the gaps that we see today in terms of reporting of disabilities, in terms of lack of community stakeholders when there is a policy discussion that is going on, selective ignorance that we've covered, and a little bit of the policy making as well?
Sure. Well, when it comes to policy making, whether it's in the US, India, or any other country, people with a disability are not often at the table. It's often non-disabled people that are drafting legislation or protocols that impact people with a disability, but they don't actually consult people with a disability for that kind of input. Or if they do have some disabled advisors, or they bring people in as consultants, for better or worse, and this goes back to the poverty correlation with disability, the people they bring in are from wealthier classes.
Affluent, educated.
Exactly. And many of the advocates that I've spoken to here in Bhubaneswar and elsewhere, again, they're aware that they are privileged. I'm aware they are privileged, but often they are humble enough and self-aware enough to know that they don't actually represent all the vast diversity of people with a disability, especially when you take into consideration the lack of resources that most people with disabilities face. But again, because of, let's say, systemic barriers, those people, the really vulnerable people, the people who have a disability and are very poor, these are not people who are trained on using social media platforms. These are people who don't have an education. They have not had the ability to have their voices heard. So I mean, yeah, there's going to be biases if governments only listen to wealthy disabled people, but often these advocates are aware enough to realize that governments need to broaden their own perspective rather than just listening to the people with disabilities who have these kind of social advantages.
That's an interesting idea. I always assume that because Orissa has a DRR, an SA, PCC. So for people who don't know what a DRR is, it's disaster risk reduction and a state action plan on climate change. So I always assumed if you have a good policy, the implementation might be a problem. But even with the idea that we have stakeholders representing the community, but again, there's a lack there in the understanding.
There's no mention of disability in Odisha's climate change action plan for the current year. So that is something that is missing. And I know advocates here
have been trying hard, yes.
They're trying to get that into the next documentation.
For our listeners, let's make it a little easier. We'll talk about early disaster resilience. We'll talk about during the disaster, the services that you require, and then we'll go to post-disaster management, which is response, resilience, and then beyond. Given that you have such vast experience in disaster management from the lenses of disability, would you be able to tell us where we've gone wrong?
Well, so I think it was a good thing that during my stays here in Odisha that a disaster did not occur. So I was unable to, witness firsthand, how things, really come together during a disaster.
You left when we were in the peak heat of summer.
That's right.
We usually have a cyclone in summer and one in October. Right. So you missed both.
Yeah, no, I'm not around. I think when I was leaving in May, Cyclone Mocha was forming in the Bay of Bengal, but it didn't strike Odisha. I think it was, and unfortunately, I think it was targeted. It was aiming toward Myanmar, but even then, it didn't cause. I don't think any. I'm not aware of any significant.
But I'm sure you've heard about Fanny and 99.
Of course. So that was So I mean, if you look at the recent history of disaster risk reduction in Odisha, you had 10,000 people die in 1999 during that super cyclone that, even before they started naming cyclones in the region. Yeah. And, that was a real turning point for Odisha as well as India. And, in the years following that, you had not only this state, but across the board, disaster protocol being adopted. There were action plans, put into effect. And, if then, let's fast forward then 20 years, Cyclone Fanny in 2019, I think officially they only say 63 people lost their lives.
Correct.
And that, from what I understand, from what I've read, and from everyone I've talked to, that is due in large part to the advanced protocol that have been implemented. There are somewhere around 900 storm shelters or facilities used as shelters across Odisha. That was according to the Odisha State Disaster Management Authority. There is on paper, they prioritize the evacuation and sheltering of vulnerable populations, which include women, children, the elderly, as well as people with disabilities. And that certainly has, I met someone in the Ganjam district who back in 2013 during Cyclone Filene, he's a wheelchair user, and ahead of the storm, people, he consented to people coming to his home, and they, brought him, they transported him to the local shelter, which had been augmented with ramps and as well as disabled-friendly washrooms, restrooms. And so that, is a positive example. And even though I did not have the experience of witnessing a disaster, while it would have been good for the documentary that I'm making, I think it's an overall good for everybody that a disaster didn't happen. But I did get to observe a rehearsal on June 19th. So every year across the state here, local districts and blocks and other communities rehearse cyclone preparedness. There's kind of a rehearsal. So I went back to the Ganjam district and visited a community where I got to know some of the disaster management officials there, and they showed us how their volunteers would go to the home of someone who is disabled and transport them in one way or another, put them on a stretcher, push them in their wheelchair to the storm shelter. And this particular storm shelter that I went to, it was rather new, I think built within the past 10 years. And so...
And are these volunteers trained to handle...
They have received, according to the officials I've spoken with, these volunteers have been given some training. And just, I was unable to witness, I wasn't around for any of the training sessions, but it was clear that these volunteers, and these are all young men, probably in their early 20s, like, it was clear from the protocol they were following that, yeah, they had some knowledge. But I would say that their training does not consider the vast range of disabilities and risks involved with trying to transport people with various disabilities. And that was something that one of the advocates I spoke to here in Bhubaneswar, Shruti Mahapatra at the organization Swabhiman, said that, she points out that, she's a spinal cord injury patient. She was in a car accident some decades ago. She said that, if she was in that kind of situation, much more harm could be done than good, because with spinal cord injury patients, if you lift them, you can cause them to go into spasms. You can cause much more harm. So she didn't feel that the volunteers, as good of work as they're doing...
Plus, as a woman, people need to know where to touch you.
That's, of course, another concern. Yes. Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out.
Nobody talks about gender with disabilities. There are speakers, of course.
Sure.
But like we said, there's no reporting. There's no media talking about it.
Women with disabilities are even more vulnerable. And then if you tack on the risks they face in the next phase of disasters, the sheltering, that is complicated too. Sexual violence, harassment, these things can happen too. Not to mention, just considerations of reproductive health care while in a sheltering situation. Maybe some of these women would require full-time assistance care. Are their families, were their families able to also evacuate with them? Is there space for their caregiver if it's not a family member?
A family with multiple PWDs as well?
I saw them too in my reporting. In Bangladesh, I certainly came across that, families with multiple children with disabilities. So yeah, all these things, and it's not clear, have the staff, and these again are largely volunteers who work these shelters during an evacuation. They provide food and basic care, but how much can they really know about caring for someone with multiple disabilities, someone who really needs certain care?
Yeah,
and it's and I think up to this point, the evacuating and sheltering, Odisha has done a benchmarkable job with saving lives and protecting lives. But it doesn't mean that they can rest on their laurels either. There's always room for improvement. But I absolutely want to give credit where credit is due. What has happened here since the '99 cyclone has undoubtedly saved lives. And I think for other countries or regions that have, similar demographics, similar resources, similar, economic conditions, I think what has happened here, could be replicated for areas that have like similar threats due to disasters and climate change related disasters.
Odisha is being actually hailed by the World Bank and multiple countries for the way they have designed the entire resilience package and the policies that have been developed.
No doubt.
But is that enough post-disaster?
Nothing's ever enough, right? This is always a bar that can keep being raised.
Yeah.
This is where the problems that were identified by the people I spoke with, not only the advocates here in Bhubaneswar, but also the people on the ground who I met. There was little in terms of post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery. So I'm thinking of one interview that I did with a woman who lives in Puri, not too far off the beach. During Cyclone Fani in 2019, she was able to evacuate herself to the shelters right down the road from where she lives. It was a school. The school was inaccessible, so she had to park her three-wheeled motorized tricycle outside the shelter, and basically someone had to drag her into the shelter. There was only one step, but one step is enough to make it inaccessible to get into. And this was a school. And she said, almost instantly her trike was, blown down the street by the winds of the cyclone and damaged, unrepairably damaged.
And we don't have a policy to replace these.
It took 3 months, and it took a lot of pushing, and she had to reach out to advocates in Puri to help her get a replacement because she's a working woman. She runs kind of a home kitchen where she's preparing some kind of chicken dish, and then, she would cook it in her very, very modest home in Puri, and then, get onto her trike and then go to a busier section along maybe one of the busier roads in her neighborhood and sell that. And that's her main way. And she doesn't have children. I don't believe she had a spouse. Like, that is her main way. She is, a very independent person in many regards. She supports herself. I think she said she, had contracted polio as a child, and that impacted her mobility. But she is a very resilient person. But for those 3 months that she did not have her mobility device, it really impacted her ability to earn an income. And she already lived in a very economically precarious situation, and so that disaster, coupled with the difficulty in getting a replacement device, only worsened her economic situation.
I mean, not just disasters, what about beyond the disasters? What are the solutions that we're looking at?
Sure. I think we have to look at solutions when we start talking about beyond. And something that every advocate that I've ever spoken with, in Odisha, back home in my state of New Jersey, in the Philippines, where I've done reporting on this, and of course throughout Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, where I've been this year, there aren't enough people with a disability at the table. And this goes back again, with the reliance on maybe just talking to the wealthy advocates. But, when I had off the record meetings here in Odisha, I spoke to the OSDMA. I spoke with other local agencies here in Bhubaneswar. There are very few people with a disability in any sort of policy making positions. It does not appear at the OSDMA anyone is on staff that has is at the drawing board when these protocols are put together. What do they do in all these stakeholder meetings then? Like, you can talk about Sri Lanka and Maldives and Bangladesh. They face the same issues. Sure. Well, so some of these agencies, they will bring in, again, outside consultants to have talks, but how much is that just a formality, and how much is it really being implemented? But do they accept these suggestions is the question. Right, and then bureaucrats are bureaucrats. They're going to do the amount of work that they're tasked with doing, and the bottom line, how much money does it cost to augment storm shelters and make them accessible, or provide sign language interpreters, or come up with some other mechanism to provide sign interpretation for people who are deaf. And that was something that I've heard from people here too, deaf people who have experienced these storms, that there is very little information, or historically has been very little information provided in accessible formats for them. So when we talk about climate change, well, people don't really know the terminologies that are available in the
lexicon. We call it floods, we call it droughts, we call it cyclones, we call it migration. Where are the policies regarding the same?
Well, sure, Deepsha. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and certainly there's a lot of policy and awareness across the board that is lacking. But I just think, an example here in Odisha about, you mentioned migration. India's first climate change migrants has been, said to be people from Satavaya here in Odisha. This was a community of people who made their living off the Bay of Bengal, fishing and such. But because of erosion that had been exacerbated by sea level rise over the past decade or so, they had been moved inland I can't remember, maybe it was 15 kilometers. So their whole way of living, the way they earned an income, supported their families, had changed because of the relocation policy. I am unaware, and I tried looking into this, speaking with advocates who had done work in Satavaya. There was no consideration given about disability and how these people were relocated. And I just think, if we're talking about beyond a disaster, and sea level rise, let's say, is a slow boiling disaster. It's something you measure very incrementally. Someone who has a disability and, let's say, does earn an living off of working to a fishing adjacent industry. Maybe they're making fishing nets, maybe they're selling at a market. If all of a sudden you don't live on the coastline and you can't easily get to the coastline, maybe there's, I don't know what kind of accessibility is available and where these communities were moved to. A person with a disability can completely lose their source of income, their support networks, you name it. And I've seen this in the Philippines, and to some extent in Bangladesh, and I think the Maldives, where I've done some reporting, will need to consider this too down the line.
Would you tell us a little about these countries that you've been in, these small island nations, how they're dealing with climate change and disasters for that matter?
Sure thing. So over the course of the past year, I spent time reporting in Bangladesh, first as a National Geographic explorer, and then starting in February, I did 3 months here in Odisha, followed by 2 months in Sri Lanka, mostly out of Colombo, but did some field work there, and then 2 months in the Maldives, where I went to some islands. The circumstances in the Bay of Bengal, so coastal Bangladesh and here in Odisha, quite similar. An increase of severe tropical cyclones, sea level rise, warming waters, fluctuating monsoon seasons. The monsoon is not starting when it used to, and that affects, fishing. That affects agriculture. So there's all these kind of side effects. So the concerns in Bangladesh and here were quite similar. Sri Lanka, a little different. Still in the northern Indian Ocean, which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says is one of the fastest changing regions due to climate change. In Sri Lanka, I had difficulty getting in touch with any government official. So I really wanted to focus on more anecdotal stories, real experiences by, in particular, women with a disability who had become disabled during Sri Lanka's 30-year-long civil war. So I went up to Mannar in the north, the Tamil-speaking area, where I met some women who had lost limbs during the war. They were fighters and had been injured during explosions or other types of warfare. And one interview I did with someone really stuck out to me. She talked about the trauma, not of becoming disabled. She said she had accepted that long ago. She has a job, she has a family, children. She said the trauma comes back during floods. That when her community, which is in a low-lying area, it's fairly close to the sea, ponds and some lakes in her surrounding area, it floods. And Sri Lanka is seeing more floods and kind of cloudburst scenarios where you're having downpours really fast. And, that's not enough time for the land to absorb water in that kind of volume. So, she said, as someone who only has one arm, she cannot take both of her very young children to the shelter. She said so she has to make a choice, who to carry to the shelter first. And then she would have to come back and get another child. And
Wow.
I think this has only happened once. And I don't recall offhand now from the interview if her husband was also there, but the husband I think is not often there because I believe he's a fisherman. So she said it's that time when she's faced with these new threats by climate change, that it starts making her think about the times before the war when she didn't have a disability and how this all is complicated. And she, of course, was unaware. There was no provisions in place where she lived to assist with evacuating. You would really have to rely on family members or neighbors to help you out if you had, family members that needed assistance during an evacuation.
And what about your experience in Maldives?
We've all heard how vulnerable the Maldives is to sea level rise. It's the world's flattest country. There are some, just under 200 inhabited islands across the country. But there are reports that say by 2050, something like 70% of inhabitable land in the Maldives will no longer be inhabitable because of increased flooding or sea level rise, erosion. So I expected when I spent the final 2 months of my Fulbright research in the Maldives that I would hear more about plans for relocations and evacuations, and I didn't. It was really surprising. People that I spoke to did not seem to think that was needed or would ever even happen. When I tried talking to people about disasters related to climate change, all people could think about was the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which of course was very traumatic. It just washed over these islands. And I spoke to people who survived that. But I did not see, and I talked to government officials, disaster management officials, and they said they have a long way to go to include people with disabilities in their disaster planning. And especially, and again, and I think with relocations, like we've seen here in Odisha that I spoke about, like it doesn't seem to really be on the radar, at least vis-a-vis sea level rise. But, I just think about accessibility in the Maldives. They're making a lot of progress, and new construction does have ramps, and the buses around the capital area have ramps to get onto the buses. But I visited one island where they had built an evacuation shelter in the years following the '04 tsunami, and to get into that shelter, you have to go up 15 steps. There was no ramp. There was no lift, elevator. And I spoke with a guy who lives on that island. He uses a wheelchair, and he said, how am I supposed to stay safe if there's a flood or because of a sea level rise, another tsunami? He's like, who's going to pick me up to take me up those steps? And I don't even know if that's possible with his type of disability, if it's even safe to carry him. So I was a little surprised about the lack of consideration, in terms of universal design, accessibility for that shelter. Now, I've heard on some other islands that they do have more accessible shelters, but it doesn't seem to be across the board.
And do you have any good takeaways from these countries? Some implementations that have happened, some ideas that they've been following?
I think here in Odisha had the most positive, benchmarkable protocol and other measures in place compared to what I've seen throughout South Asia, or even back in the US and New Jersey, where I'm from. There is a conversation here, at least, about how to include people with a disability in disaster policy. A discussion that has been led by this kind of small but vocal advocacy network community here in Bhubaneswar and in the surrounding districts. They are pressuring government officials to make DRR and many other policies more inclusive and accessible. But, again, when you're up against a thick wall of bureaucracy, progress is going to be slow. And if you don't have people on the inside, disabled people helping make those decisions, then the progress will be even slower. But again, I think what I saw here in Odisha is commendable in many ways. Doesn't mean they can stop and, pat themselves on the back now. There's still more work to be done, but there has been progress made here that could be replicated in other places.
On that note, thank you so much, Jason, for being here. Miles to go before we sleep, of course.
Yes, thank you, Deepsha. It was a pleasure.
Do you have a message for our listeners?
If you would like to follow any of my work in reporting, you can visit my website, lens15.com, sign up for my newsletter, where later this year I will start producing some of the content, the reporting, as well as filming that I did while I was here in Odisha and around the region.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you so much.
Thank you.